So I'm Josh Drayton. I'm a Communications and Outreach Director for the California Cannabis Industry Association. CCIA was formed in 2013. Now at this stage, as we're entering 2019, headed to 2020, we've grown to about 500 members that represent every different sector of the industry, as well as ancillary services. So I came from a political background. I got involved in state regulations in 2015 when we were really looking at regulating the medical market, and then very quickly moved into passing Proposition 64, which meant working on adult use regulations and ultimately combining the two. So it's been a few years of a lot of work, a lot of education, working with our members, regulators, legislators on trying to put best practices in place for the industry that allow it to grow, to be legitimate. We fight for our open market policies, and we'll probably have no shortage of work for the years to come.
How successful do you guys feel you've been?
Well, it depends. There's so many different metrics in how I would measure that. I think we've done a really great job in educating regulators and legislators. I think each year it gets better. I still remember, 3 years ago working with Sacramento regulators, and we forget in the cannabis industry that we have our own language, and we have an assumption that everyone understands what we're talking about. So as we were discussing manufacturing processes and butane extraction versus CO2 extraction, I remember they kind of halted us and were like, well, hold on, how does it start? Is it a seed? Is it a plant? How many cycles do you get in a year? So that educational lift has been critical, and that's where I think we've really excelled. At this stage, we've probably given 150 tours of commercial facilities for legislators, for regulators, for inspectors, not only for the state of California, but for Canada, for Mexico, for Germany, for New Zealand, for France. So I think that's really important. The world is watching how California deals with cannabis, and we're at the forefront of making sure they're educated in the right way with cannabis professionals.
Nice.
Yeah, so the cannabis industry in California evolves daily. We see many different changes, many different levels of innovation. And as we head into 2020, I anticipate that the administration is going to work closer with the industry to really combat some of the challenges we're facing. We currently have a very strong illicit market. We're dealing with a vape crisis due to the strong illicit market and illicit products that consumers have access to because of so many banned areas. Moving forward, we're going to really focus on overturning bans throughout the state. We're currently dealing with roughly 60% of the state that is in a ban, only 40% of the state has regulations on the books. So we want to make sure we address that. Beyond that, I think the cannabis industry is going to really great places. We're seeing more professionals enter this industry. We're seeing consumers being more educated and more open to the growth of the industry. As we saw in West Hollywood this last year, they approved cafes and lounges, which are a very different concept than kind of the legacy operators in Northern California that tend to do kind of tasting rooms. So this is a much more full-service restaurant, bar, serving cannabis products and cannabis foods. We're seeing an increase in cannabis tourism. As a former resident of Humboldt County, one of the great experiences of my life was being able to go to sun-grown farms and have a connection to where the plant is grown. So I think we're headed in really great directions with it. I'm seeing more cannabis dinners. I'm seeing more cannabis events. Granted, I do live in the Bay Area, which has always been, a stronghold for the cannabis industry. So I anticipate that we're going to see a lot more innovation, and I think we're going to see a streamlining of business operations and true growth of the industry. One of the things we discussed on the panel today is the current vape crisis. Vape apocalypse, as Julie Carter referred to it as. And I want to make sure that, for our membership and for the greater cannabis community, that we're always operating with facts, making sure we're using data, making sure we're not hyping a situation, and that we're collaborating. We need to collaborate with Department of Public Health, with the administration, in truly identifying what commonalities exist in these illnesses, and making sure we're tending to public safety and public health. That is the goal of this industry. So what we do know at this point is that in California we've had 2 deaths. Those 2 deaths happened in areas that have banned cannabis, where those gentlemen had admitted to purchasing illicit cannabis from the only sources that they have. You know, in banned areas, that's what we need to remember. When we ban, we do not remove cannabis from a community. We remove tested, regulated cannabis from those communities. So we're only giving consumers the option of illicit product. Again, we're working very closely with our manufacturers, providing R&D to the Department of Public Health, sharing any sort of research that may exist. Our testing labs are working to do new tests to identify any sort of additives in the actual vapor. And ultimately, I think this is a real push for education. Consumers need to know why it's important to support the regulated market. They need to know that their product is tested, that it has gone through those rigorous testing standards. They need to know where their tax dollars are going. And ultimately, the long play is we need to remove the illicit market that is causing all of these problems.
Okay.
I think one of the most important things that the cannabis industry needs to do is to stay engaged in this process. And the best way to stay engaged is to join a cannabis trade association like the California Cannabis Industry Association. We've existed since before medical regulations were even started or discussed. We continue to work on policy reform that really focuses on public safety and public health while streamlining business operations for the industry. And again, this is a very living, breathing process. So getting engaged in CCIA, having a seat at the table, will only further all of our goals.
All right. Thank you very much.